Jodie, how are we going to start this conversation?
I have no idea. Starting a conversation about invisible illnesses is really hard.
Hey.
See what I did there?
Yeah, I do see what you did there, yeah. Well, talking about invisible illnesses, see my segue. I know all about invisible illnesses because I have a condition called acute intermittent porphyria. And to look at me, you would think I was perfectly well.
Mm-hmm.
And inside, my metabolism is basically doing its own thing.
Cool.
And not what it should be doing.
Not so cool.
Not so cool, no. So that's why I am doubly interested in invisible illnesses. One, because I was a teacher and I understand what it's like for pupils in school with something that you can't see. And because I have the same problem. And if anyone ever says to me again, well, you look all right, I swear I will be taking physical action.
Yeah.
It's your own time you're wasting. Ramblings from Beyond the Classroom with Marie and Jodie.
So this week we're talking to Sophie Ainsworth, a former student of mine who has started the charity RAiSE, which stands for Raising Awareness of Invisible Illness in Schools and Education.
Sophie was diagnosed with the autoimmune disease lupus when she was just 14. It was her experiences at school which motivated her to form the charity, which worked with schools and other education providers to promote better understanding and support for students with invisible illnesses. Welcome, Sophie.
Yeah,
Lovely
hi,
to meet you.
Well, thank you for having me.
Nice to see you.
So I'm going to start off with the simple question. What is an invisible illness and how do you know if someone's suffering from one?
So there's no real universally agreed medical definition for an invisible illness, but generally it's any health condition that's not easily visible to other people. So for me, something like lupus or like Marie just mentioned, porphyria, but it can include things like epilepsy, which you mentioned, and as well as mental health conditions. There's not really a defining kind of way we can categorize them, I suppose, other than the fact that you just can't really see that someone might be ill. I think for me in school, it was, even though I was feeling really unwell and most days feeling quite terrible, I looked like any of my other healthy peers. And I think one of the problems that we find is that for teachers, that is really difficult because you don't know if someone is suffering.
Yeah.
And I guess in that as well, you don't know whether someone's having a good day or a bad day, and kind of, whereas with other illnesses, you can kind of see that a little bit easier.
Yeah, definitely. And I think with a lot of invisible illnesses, they are also chronic. And so it's something that's long term and can fluctuate day to day, hour to hour. And that's one thing that can be quite difficult to, I think, understand. And I think as well with a lot of other more acute illnesses, you see people improve. If someone's got a broken leg, you see the cast on, and then you see it getting better, and you see them then when they're just on crutches, and then it's then it's healed. And I think a lot of the time people struggle, if they've not experienced it themselves, to kind of grasp the concept of a chronic condition that is here to stay.
Yeah, I think you're right there, Sophie. I think schools are quite good at dealing with the acute crisis, aren't they? But when it comes to someone who's going to be regularly poorly, that's more difficult, which leads me into the next question. Why is there a need for RAiSE?
There's a need for RAiSE because it's a much more widespread issue than I think a lot of people think. In every classroom, there will most likely be more than one young person with an invisible illness of some sort, and each individual will have their own individual set of needs. And I think one thing that maybe makes things a little bit more difficult is how varied so many conditions can be. You could have two peoples even with the same condition and have very different experiences of it. I think what we sort of try and do with RAiSE and with encapsulating them all under the umbrella of invisible illnesses is that even if, say, the symptoms are very different, a lot of the strategies you can put in place and the ways of communicating or those day-to-day kind of general understanding of supporting a young person can be similar, no matter how different the conditions might be.
And do you find kind of, so I know when we talk about like specific learning difficulties, we kind of say that if you create an environment that supports that specific learning difficulty, you support everyone. It actually ends up helping everyone. Would you say it's similar with invisible illness?
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of the things that we generally try and promote is just having good levels of trust with your students. It's having good communication. It's being just generally quite just understanding and a little bit more gentle, I suppose. It's sometimes giving people the benefit of the doubt if they might be struggling, and just, I don't know, maybe being a little bit easy on them when they need. And I think that is just maybe a kinder, sort of more, I've potentially been called naive in the past, but that general kind of having a nicer way of going about things, I think, is always going to benefit any student. And I think as well, we've talked a lot about young people's mental health in the last few years, and especially throughout the COVID pandemic.
Of course.
So a lot of these strategies and a lot of these ways of supporting young people will be beneficial to the whole classroom. But that being said, then I think there's the added layer when someone has a chronic condition that it needs to be taken into account.
So what should teachers do when they first find out that one of their students has an invisible illness?
I think what we advise as sort of our first starting point is to just ask the question, how can I help? I think we really try to focus on the idea that every person is an individual case. Everyone will require or want different levels of support. And so with the fact that so many conditions teachers will most likely not know anything about. I had never heard of lupus when I got diagnosed with it, so I would never expect my teacher to know much about it. So I think the first call is to say, what do you need? How can we help you? Depending on the age of the pupil, obviously that could be talking to them directly, talking to them with their parents, but just making sure that pupil is at the forefront of that conversation. In our schools pack, which is a resource that we've created alongside teachers and pupils and healthcare professionals and charities, we have created a health passport, which is a resource that can be used to talk through with the pupil about their individual needs and break things down into how that might look day to day in the classroom. So that breaks it down on a more practical level, I think, than a lot of healthcare plans that might already be being used or recommended. And in our one, it's very specific, breaking down into categories like, on a good day, I can do X, Y, Z. On a bad day, I might need some help doing X, Y, Z. As well as giving information about any medications that school might need to be aware of and those practical elements. But I think one thing when we were developing that, some of the feedback that we got from the young people was, in a lot of cases, things like the list of medications that someone was on wasn't necessarily that relevant to the teacher. Obviously, it's important that that's there and that's, documented in case of any sort of emergencies. But a lot of people would say taking their medications at home and not necessarily being something that impacted their school life. And the more practical things of actually some days I might just not be able to do PE, or I might need to leave the classroom to go to the toilet at a moment's notice. Those
definitely.
kind of more illness specific things that are going to be the things that affect them day to day were the more important messages that they wanted to get across.
I always found as well when I was a teacher that the handing out of toilet passes was like a one-size-fits-all thing. Like every kid in a class would have a toilet pass, which defeated the point of a toilet pass.
Definitely. But yeah, toilet passes are definitely a thing that we've had lots of problems with lots of the young people we speak to. It's a bugbear of ours at RAiISE that that's such a big problem. But again, it's those kind of, like we were talking about earlier, how some things that are supporting a young person with Crohn's, equally someone who doesn't have a health condition that means they have to go to the toilet. If you've got to go to the toilet, you've got to go to the toilet.
Yeah, exactly. So as listeners will know, we usually feature listener feedback in the show. Today, though, we're going to take a slightly different tack and we're going to share some experiences from people who've worked with RAiISE.
This is from a young person, age 15. When I say I need a break, it's hard to be questioned about it, and it makes me feel awkward because it's difficult to explain. I feel like I'm not being believed. Is it your experience, Sophie, that sometimes teachers don't believe students with invisible illnesses when they feel unwell? And why do you think that is?
Yeah, that's definitely something that we've come across quite a lot. I think one thing that I found quite interesting talking to different groups of people is that the older the people gets, the better their experiences seem to be. That is
Yeah.
talking generally. People have difficulties at all sort of stages of school life, but I think generally it's been the younger, maybe more primary school age children that have had the biggest problems getting believed, and so it's
Mm.
going through to high school as well. But then maybe seeing that shift by the time they get into college or university, that
Yeah.
suddenly they're seen as a bit more grown up and that they're just trusted
Mm.
a little bit more. I think there's been quite a theme we found with teachers not having that level of trust in young
Mm.
people. I think it's come up quite a lot with things like PE lessons, maybe, where someone's been said, "Oh, I'm really sorry, I can't do PE today," because of a particular condition, and said, "Oh, you just trying to get out across country," has been quite a
Yeah.
common
Yeah.
response. And I think that's always been quite frustrating. And I think the realistically, if you were trying to get out PE, you'd just forget your PE kit, wouldn't you? You wouldn't come up with something as convoluted as a complex autoimmune disease.
No.
um, and
No, that'd be really going it, wouldn't it?
definitely, and but I think I think it's a natural sort of instinct. I think the nature of an invisible illness, we just, as part of human nature, are less likely to, I think, just be able to compute what it might be. If you can't see
Mm.
something, you have less understanding of it. And I think that's just one of the main messages that we're trying to promote, is just to raise more awareness of invisible illnesses so that people
Mm.
know that just because you can't see something doesn't mean someone isn't really suffering with this.
Yeah.
And so having that better general awareness, because so often we'll have a conversation and someone will say that someone won't be believed, or they'll say, oh, they're just making something up, or I'm not so sure about that. But then we've had a further conversation about how difficult some of these conditions really are to live with day to day,
Mm.
and people just don't have a clue, and it's stuff that they have never come across before, aren't aware of. And so there's just a bit more of a natural distrust, and as soon as we have that conversation about what is going on, that's when it's a bit of a light bulb moment, I think, and people go, oh god, I feel really bad that I've not noticed that, or oh god, like I've
Yeah.
made a mistake there. And so I think the message that I've always kind of had is that I would rather have the wool pulled over my eyes a little bit and have one person get away with whatever they're trying to get away with, than
Mm.
make 9 people feel bad or feel like they have to prove themselves. I
Yeah.
think the main message that a lot of our young people say is it's just kind of exhausting having to constantly justify that you're ill and constantly
Yeah.
prove it. I think
Mm.
one thing that I always found quite strange was, say I wasn't feeling very well, I would ring up to say that I couldn't make it in, and I found this in the workplace as well, where my voice isn't affected when I've got extreme fatigue
No.
or I'm feeling really sick. So, but on the phone, I then am like doing this. Oh, I probably need to make my voice sound a little bit weaker or
Yeah,
quiet,
sound a
but
bit
I've not got a
weak.
cough.
Yeah. No.
And so I think just being able to say, look, I know my body, I know I'm ill, and have someone understand that that's the truth, you're not exaggerating, is really
Mm.
important. And I think building a level of trust between teachers and pupils and parents is a long time thing that you need to be building up over
Yeah.
time. And just knowing then for both of you that everyone's on the same page, that the teacher knows how they
Yeah.
can support the young people, and that the young person knows that they can go to that teacher and feel confident that they're going to be believed and they don't need to prove anything. I think being ill when you're
Mm.
young is hard enough, and They just don't need that added pressure of constantly having to prove yourself, but also in the same vein, it's kind of a constant reminder, having to constantly explain just how ill you are, isn't a nice thing to have to do.
It's your own time you're wasting. So why not stick the kettle on, put your feet up and have a cuppa? Ah, bliss.
You mentioned earlier about kind of as they get older, people start to believe them a little bit more. But do you think as well, kind of, the individual gets better at kind of explaining and their own coping mechanisms and kind of, sort of managing other people with it? Like I'm very fortunate that I don't have any hidden illnesses, but I am dyslexic, and I know that as I have got older and further away from that diagnosis, I'm better at explaining what I need for people to support me. So it's the best comparison I can get. And I have a rower who has some additional needs, who's 17, and they just really to the point about explaining stuff. And I just wouldn't expect that from a 13-year-old because,
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And I think it's the age of someone, but also I think generally just time. I think if you've been diagnosed with something since you were a baby, then you've kind of had that long time. Whereas if you're maybe getting diagnosed with something at 14, 15 years old, it's more the length of time I think maybe you've had a condition generally. And learning how to navigate that. Because one thing that we also talk about in our awareness guide, just support pack for schools to use, is about what to do when someone's getting newly diagnosed and have it what a difficult sort of period of time that can be for so many people. A lot of invisible illnesses take a long time to diagnose. A lot of them might be rare. And then there's also lots of people who are in the position of not having a diagnosis at all, but being very unwell. You can have people who are going through years and years of medical investigations or just confusion without getting the answer. And I think that's sometimes a difficult position to be in because there's no, nice, neatly packaged diagnosis to get your head around. You've just got the illness side of it, and you are feeling terrible.
Yeah.
You are just a big mental toll as well, and not getting any answers. And I think that can sometimes make it hard in providing support because a lot of things require sort of more of a tick box. Oh, what have you got? I don't know. And so again, that's when our sort of practical strategies and things like that come into play, where it's not about having to put a name on something. It's just saying, look, I know you're struggling. How can we help? What will make it better? And so that's been quite a, I think, complicated area as well that we've seen quite a bit of.
I think the hammering of attendance is a major issue. At my kids' school, they say, 95%, if you got that on a test, that's really good. But for attendance, that's not good enough. And what I find is my daughter, who does have a recurring issue, is really, really guilty about having time off, and she's panicking and that's making her feel worse. And I know you had a bit of a thing with an attendance officer, didn't you, Sophie, at one point? Yeah,
I did. Yeah, my attendance, I got a letter about my attendance once it was a generic letter that went to all the students who had dropped below a certain percentage. Only mine, they'd acknowledged that there might be other reasons why that was. I've been in and out of hospital quite a lot at that time. And the little additional sentence at the bottom said, "We understand that Sophie has had some health issues, but we expect that these are resolved by now."
brilliant.
And I think by that point, I was very frustrated. I just sort of laughed. But I was just amazed that my school had found a cure for my incurable condition that all my doctors had missed.
I mean, I know teachers are legends, but still.
Yeah, they really pulled it out of the bag.
Miracle work, that,
innit? And so so things like that, I think it's just checking what you're saying sometimes. I think that there was obviously some sort of thought process that they wanted to acknowledge that there was a reason I'd been off.
They didn't.
I was like, you were so close. You were so close. Definitely. But attendance is something that we hear time and time again. of people just being so frustrated by it, and hearing it from both sides as well. It's hearing it from young people, it's hearing it from parents, it's hearing it from teachers as well, because so much of the time it isn't their fault. You know, it's not teachers demanding that people are in, it's the additional pressures that are being forced upon them. One thing that we're very keen to get rid of forever is attendance awards. We've had so many cases come to us where people have been denied end of school trips or any sort of treats that the rest of the class are getting because they've been in hospital. I was talking to a young person who was a cancer patient who, because of an appointment, didn't get to join in the end of year treat. Or we've had cases where the entire class have missed out on things. Say everyone gets an ice cream on the last day of term, but that only happens if the whole class gets 100% attendance. And someone who's, you know, not been well, who's been off school for a few days, is the reason that the class didn't get the ice creams. And it's just
so wrong.
But it just seems to be happening so often, and it's just so frustrating to hear. And I think we hoped that things like the COVID pandemic would improve that. I think we hoped that, especially with attitudes to people going into school or work with a bad cold or a bug or something like that, we shouldn't be encouraging people to go in with that. We shouldn't be encouraging children who are ill to be going into school, whether that's an acute illness or a chronic one. And it's not good for people's long-term health. It's not good for people's education. And it's quite a frustrating issue.
Got another comment here. This is from a parent. The teacher in her class encouraged me to keep in touch and tell him how she was doing. His attitude was that he needed to know how she was so that he could be prepared in class. How can teachers adapt teaching styles to help students with invisible illnesses?
I think that is a generally good technique to be in sort of good communication with someone about how things are going, how things are. And I think that can be done in a relatively informal way, I think, without being too intrusive as well. And I think the key part of this is always to be led by how much the pupil wants. But I do think it's very useful, and we do encourage people to talk to the teachers and keep them informed on how things are going, purely on a sort of caring capacity as well, just so they're aware of how you might be feeling. I think in terms of teaching styles, it's using that awareness of how someone might be doing to support yourself in the classroom. I think I remember an example of a young person who had been in hospital and missed a particular topic, and they said the following week they just got out of hospital, they were still feeling a bit rubbish, and the teacher picked on them for a question on the topic that they'd missed, and they said, "I'm sorry, I don't know," and the teacher had potentially forgotten that they weren't in the class or didn't acknowledge it, and then went, "Oh, you have to know, you should know this by now, this has been we've been talking about this all week, this is really important stuff, I can't believe you don't know it," and had a bit of a dig, I suppose, about the fact that they didn't know, and it made them feel really awful. And so I think having those kind of being aware of, you know, if someone's been off, maybe they're not the person to choose, in the same way if someone's got a serious anxiety disorder, maybe they're not maybe the person to pick on to do the reading. I think just being aware of that and having sensitivity to those kind of things in the classroom is really important. I know when I was in school, I had teachers that we were just very aware that quite often I was having really bad fatigue, and could see that I was maybe not quite alert or focused as I usually would be. And I remember a couple of times them coming out to me saying, "Don't worry, Steph, I can tell you look a bit tired today. We'll, like, don't worry about it." Like, and just having just a little comment that no one else heard. It was very quiet, very unassuming. Just to kind of acknowledge, don't worry. Like, and it doesn't even need to be acknowledged necessarily. It's just maybe scoping the classroom and seeing that such body who you know has such a condition maybe isn't on top form today, and we'll let that slide. We're not
Yeah.
going to push that person too
Yeah.
much today.
Yeah.
So it's those kind of subtle things that I think are what make the big differences. I think it's those small, everyday, incidental things that can really be a big impact for someone with an invisible illness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think you could link that to the wider culture of the school as well, really, because it's all about just being compassionate and understanding, isn't it? And where's a pupil that doesn't need that? They all do. So, Sophie, what are the key messages that you'd like teachers and educators to take from working with your charity? And also, how can they get in touch?
So the key messages that I think all the young people that we work with would want teachers to take away is to trust them, to believe them, and to just, I think, ask. I think if you're not sure, ask. Say, how can I help? What can we do to support you? And the biggest thing I think is to treat people on an individual basis, which I understand is difficult with the time pressures, with you got 30 kids in a classroom. Completely sympathize with that, but it's just knowing that each person is an individual and each condition is going to be different for every person. So then to get in touch with us, so we have created that, as I've mentioned so throughout, a bunch of resources, a school pack, we call it, that has an awareness guide which features all sorts of tips from young people, from other teachers. We worked really closely with groups of young people, parents, teachers, healthcare professionals, charities to create all these resources. It's written, not just by the young people, but teachers as well, so that the tips that we're talking about are actually useful to you, and also not just us saying something that's completely unachievable. And so that, as well as some resources that we've created, including the health passport that I mentioned earlier, some exit cards, some accessible toilet signs, which I think we really encourage people to put up in their schools, that you put on an accessible toilet, just to highlight that an accessible toilet isn't just for maybe a wheelchair user, it can be for an array of other invisible illnesses as well. And all that is downloadable from our website, which is RAiISE.co.uk. RAiSE has 2 I's for invisible illness. Anyone can also drop us an email at info@RAiISE.co.uk too.
It's your own time you're wasting. Ramblings from Beyond the Classroom with Marie and Jodie. There's not a lot they don't know about teaching.
So, as you know, at the end of each episode, we do a star, which is a positive idea, and a wish. So, this week we've done a collective star. Jodie, would you like to explain what our star is?
I think our star this week has to be those small, little, subtle things that you can do for students in the classroom that just make such a big difference. Like just checking in with them that day, acknowledging that they might be a bit fatigued, and just giving them kind of that space to feel what they need to feel and to cope how they need to cope. And it costs absolutely nothing. So I think that's going to be our star this week.
Yeah, I agree.
What do we think our wish should be this week?
Well, I would say a good wish for this week is we wish that teachers would understand and trust pupils when they say they don't feel so well or they've got this condition. Just trust that what they're saying is the truth. Even like Sophie says, if once or twice it's somebody pulling the wool over your eyes, it's worth taking that risk to support someone who's genuine. What do you think, Soph? Do you agree?
Yes, I definitely agree.
So thank you so much for joining us. This has been absolutely brilliant.
Thank you for having me.
If you've got any comments or you kind of like to be part of the conversation, the email is beyondmailbag@twinkle.co.uk, and that website for Sophie's amazing charity, again, it's RAiSE with 2 I's, so RAiISE. Of course, links and stuff will be in the description. Don't forget to like, follow, subscribe.
See you next time. Bye.
This podcast is proudly produced by Beyond. Please bear in mind the views and opinions expressed are those of individuals and may not represent those of Beyond or Twinkle.